encounter. It's we finish with music, and it is really an anticipation of next year's, probably because music will certainly be part of Paradise. Thank you very much for those who have been with us all through these this very special edition of the Dante Summer School, Dublin Dante Summer School, and a special welcome to Axel Trolese and Carole-Anne Roussel, who were perhaps among the first involved in this project, because the project of a concert inspired to Dante's works was part of the idea. Then things changed, the project, and it became an idea about a future concert. But you had a hint of what is behind the performance, because both Axel and Carole-Anne performed for us a little bit and gave us information and background to their work. So welcome Axel, welcome Carole-Anne. Their bios is on the web page, which they haven't been able to access, but I'm sure all the students of the school have seen. And I think we can start with Francesco giving us the traditional technical information, and perhaps Igor introducing maybe the theme, if you feel like it, and then maybe leave it to Axel and Carole-Anne, and then open the floor to discussion.
Okay, thank you, Renata. Welcome, everyone. I'm really sorry for the technical issue that we had with this Zoom link, but I see that other people are joining us, so the new one should really work well. So sorry again. I'm here to remind you for the last time, that as this is the last event of our Dublin Dante Summer School, that this live streaming session will be recorded and uploaded on the website. So by participating in this session and asking questions, you accept to be recorded. I kindly ask you to keep your microphones mute to avoid noise, but you can switch on your videos if you like. And you will be able to ask questions to our friends at the end of during the session. Just write your name in the chat room, or write directly your question in the chat room. And again, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us tonight and for the summer school.
Oh, thank you, Francesco, and thank you, Renata. I don't know if Renata wants to say something about tonight, the event, how it was organized, about the team is that, or I can tell you something about, or we can discuss this later about the general project. I don't know, Renata, maybe you want how this event was born.
Yeah, I think I can ask our two heroes here. A very talented young pianist, a wonderful singer. I was desperately looking for somebody who could play that terribly difficult Liszt sonata, and somebody, maybe we'll mention him, Finan Collins, suggested the name. And then I said, well, there is this wonderful music by Castelnuovo-Tedesco, and it gives you really a different perspective on Dante, and the way Dante could be perceived. And Axel mentioned Carole-Anne, and so as this cultural domino effect, the idea was born, and they both started working at it. And then you know what the story, how the story developed at that point. So maybe Axel, you can tell us how you started working. You had it in your repertoire already, right? You had Liszt.
Hello, everybody, first of all. And yes, I already was actually practicing this incredible Fantasia quasi sonata on the Divina Commedia by Franz Liszt. And of course, it was my first thought to ask Carole-Anne to play together Castelnuovo-Tedesco, since we are both artists in residence in one of the most, let's say, important institutions for music in Belgium, which is the Queen Elizabeth Music Chapel. And the nature of this institution is that all the artists in residence actually meet together to eat very often during the day. And so it was, firstly, we became friends. And then when I had this opportunity to play, to find a singer, I just thought about her also because, as you've heard, she has an incredible voice and incredible talent to, let's say, bring emotions to us with her voice and with her research, and also research not only on the musical side but on the emotional side. And so to speak again about Liszt, of course, it was Fingin Collins that you've mentioned that contacted me, and I was very happy also to have the occasion to play in Ireland, which would have been a first time for me. Now maybe we are going to have the chance to do it next year, but I think also Carole-Anne will say this, that we are very happy to bring these videos about the compositions that we would have played together, and to, let's say, introduce you a little bit of this before playing.
Maybe Carole-Anne will tell us how she felt about interpreting this music. Did you know it already? Was it part of your repertoire?
Well, I discovered it when Axel asked me to actually do this concert with him, and I immediately fell in love with how personal the music feels. You know, when you listen for the first time to these pieces, you really feel like there is something special and very subtle about the piece. Now, these pieces, for a singer, it's hard when you get to sing something that is so subtle and so natural, because you really want to, well, I would say it's easier when you sing opera, because you really, there's some things that really show off in these arias that you can do and that make you stand as a performer. And in these pieces, it's quite different, because the most important part of it is the research and every detail that you can put inside of it. So it's not much of a show-off piece, as I just mentioned. It's really subtle, and to me it feels really nice to be able to do that kind of music right now, as I mentioned, because we just can't play big music with big ensembles and know how it feels. And with a microphone as well, you know, with one microphone you can't really have a feeling of like a very big aria or big repertoire. So to me it was really, I thought it was an amazing cycle to work on, and I'm glad I have it now, and I worked on it with many specialists. And yeah, it was such an amazing music to discover. I never played Castelnuovo-Tedesco because he is well known in the musical field to be a guitar composer. So I had made some researches on him through my master's degree when I worked on a guitar concerto. But yeah, it was the first time for me that I sang this composer, and I really don't regret it.
The impression is that you both worked as philologists. In fact, you continued the work that has been done during this summer school. You really worked for the details to make it, meaningful in connection with the whole. So it was very much, it was not one part because you wanted to show off your ability, but it was one part sort of to pay homage to the whole at the same time. And I really loved your, both Axel and you working on really getting into the text, into the musical text, and also into the story that is around it and within the text. So thank you very much. It was really a pleasure to listen to, and yeah, and so very difficult, I thought, isn't it, Axel?
Well, I think that you have got to a very important point in what you've just said, because naturally, when you start to see a pianist perform this Fantasia Quasi Sonata by Liszt, the first thing that you notice, of course, is the difficulty, because it is the first element that strikes us, no? Especially if we are not musicians, and more even if you're not pianists, and that we know how to do these kind of things. Anyway, the more you try to show off in this piece, which I repeat is very easy because there are so many notes that it can so fast, so quickly become a show-off piece. But the more you do it, and the more actually it doesn't really work, because the most important inspiration has to come from the meaning of this music and from the relationship between Liszt and Dante. If you have seen the video, you have certainly heard me telling many times that this après une lecture de Dante is not a representation of the plot of the Divina Commedia, but instead is the representation of the feelings that Liszt felt while reading it, and of this relationship between them. Of course, Dante didn't know about the relationship with Liszt, but instead for Liszt, Dante was an important figure and really part of his heart as a composer, and he would have dedicated also another very important work to him just a couple of years later, which is the Dante Symphony, which is an incredible masterpiece. Maybe when you will have the opportunity to invite an orchestra to the Dante Summer School, you should make them play this fiendish symphony, because it is really difficult to play also for an orchestra.
And on the other hand, you move from something huge that really resounds, and then move into something so subtle, as Carole said. So what was your reaction to the texts themselves? So what did you think about those?
So as I would say, as a Canadian, I didn't know a lot about Dante. Of course, there's a Dante society here as well in Quebec City nearby, which I've already had the chance to perform with them. But it was less of a Dante repertoire and more of a general Italian repertoire. But to me, when I first began with my coach, I would call, so I have an Italian coach that I ask when I need some advice on that kind of repertoire. And at first it took me a little time to adjust myself and to really understand how the Italian poetry, sorry, how the Italian poetry, how it works, and what type of emotions is in there, and what is important for the Italians to find in this poetry. And I really, really enjoyed it. And my coach made me see the pure beauty of this great love, of this great admiration that we can really feel, and that Castelnuovo-Tedesco also could feel and try to put into music. And as a singer, what the most important part of it is when you analyze the poem, then you have to find a way for putting in your voice, in the sound of your voice, every thought that you have when you read. Let's say when you read a verse, you would go, oh my God, maybe this is reflecting with that, or oh my God, when he says the name of the person, it must be so intense and so vibrant because it's such an important name for the poet. So how can I put this in my voice with what Castelnuovo-Tedesco wrote? So you begin to be like a painter, you know the shape, you know what you want to put, but maybe you can put a little bit more blue into this color, and maybe you can put a little bit more red in this color. So you begin to garnish to furnish all your piece with all the sounds with that kind of choice, a little bit more of a fragrance of that here and a little bit more of this here. So that's how it works for the singer, which is kind of a microscope work, because when you hear it for the first time, of course, you can't notice everything. We do this in order for people, if they get 5%, well, it's going to be at least a 5 good percent. So, of course, when you get to hear it more and more often and many times, you get to get more details from it and to understand differently how the singer has seen the poem and how he feels it, how the singer puts it back to the ear of the audience.
Yes, I suspect it is what happens to all great art. The more you experience it, the more you get from it. So, in fact, any reading of the Divine Comedy would be different from the previous one and different from the next one, and each will give you something new and wonderful, and sometimes totally unexpected. And I really appreciate you mentioning this about reading Castelnuovo-Tedesco, which was a reading of Dante's poetry itself. So it's an accumulation of layers of meanings that culture brings together. And that leads me to one question again for Axel. The concert, as planned, was supposed to be dedicated to the idea of Europe, because this year, 2020, is also an important year for Beethoven. So we wanted to realize a concert from the heart of Europe. And it seems to be particularly important nowadays to give as much importance as possible to this, to what culture gives us. And this intercultural dialogues is, in my opinion, one of the most important gifts we as Europeans can show the world. I mean, we can really show how diversity leads to wonderful creation. So having that concert meant to me also showing how these connections can lead to something more. Of course, as soon as you become rhetoric, you should just turn off your microphone, but I feel it is important to say that. And I was wondering if Axel could tell us about it was him who proposed finishing the concert with a homage to Beethoven. So if you would like to elaborate on that.
Yes, I want to play also some Beethoven because firstly, also for all that you've said about the intercultural exchange between different artistic perspectives, which was of course part also of the Romantic period, and as I mentioned before, the exchange between Dante and Liszt can be seen also between Beethoven and Liszt, and more particularly the fact that Liszt entitles his work après une lecture de Dante, Fantasia quasi sonata. Well, this last part, Fantasia quasi sonata, is the mirroring of Sonata quasi una fantasia, which are two great piano sonatas by Ludwig van Beethoven, the Opus 27 number 1 and number 2, of which number 2 is really one of the most famous compositions for piano, because it is the Moonlight Sonata, the so-called Moonlight Sonata. And but I wanted to play the first one, the let's say less famous one, because it's my favorite actually. I like it more than the other. And it was important for me to play Beethoven also because this year is the Beethoven year, and actually with all this pandemic we haven't given him actually the most beautiful celebration that that he could have had. And so maybe next year we are going to let's say be late a little bit with a Beethoven party, but still we are not going to miss this opportunity. Also because from musical point of view, the relationship between Beethoven and Liszt is one of the most important for the development of Liszt composition style, and also for Liszt in general, for his let's say pianism and cultural development. Only to mention that Liszt was the first one in all history of music to transcribe all the 9 symphonies of Beethoven for piano solo and to play them, which is not so obvious. It is far more easy to say than to make it. And so all of this, of course, was present in his works, and the architectural structure of the Après une lecture de Dante is so precise and well balanced, also because Liszt was a great player of Beethoven, and Liszt was one of the first pianists to play the Finnish Hammerklavier sonata by Beethoven, which was not played by anybody because it was simply too difficult to play, and also because it was so much complicated to understand. But nonetheless, Liszt was a musician of this incredible capacity, and moreover, he invented the concert as we see it today. He was the first one to play the recital. He invented, I think, also the word. And this fact that today we do classical, let's say, non-vocal concerts, because opera is apart, but this kind of concert which lasts 1 hour, 1 hour and a half, it's Liszt that first had the idea of it. And so it was also from Beethoven that he started to think about all this organization. And it was natural for me to put it into the program.
Right. So I think I know you told me you didn't want to talk for a long time but I think it is a fascinating journey that you make us go through. And I was wondering if there were questions from the public. I know we have a particularly shy public, but sometimes questions do come up. And yes, let's see if we do have them. It will take time, of course. And right, so let's, Martina has a question. So Martina, you can.
Hello, everyone. And thank you for this beautiful lecture. I'm learning so much, so many new things. I have a question. It's a very naive question, actually, because I never heard about Castelnuovo-Tedesco before tonight. So I know from a quick Google search, I learned that he was of Jewish origins. And I was wondering, is there anything, and I also learned that he wrote music on biblical themes as well. I was wondering if there is a Jewish element in his music, that, and how we can identify it, and how do we play it? What makes, I mean, is there a Jewish identity of some music?
Well, I can answer to that. So when we look at this generation of of Jewish composers in Europe, when we look at that portrait, we tend to look at more to what they created afterwards, less than what really is in their music that would be Jewish. So what we can see is that all these deported composers to America brought some very colorful and very I would say that it really helped to create it led to the Broadway music as we know today. I don't know if you know the Broadway music, but it's really it's a kind of opera that is more towards the jazz colors, with brasses and with an orchestra, because most of that kind of music has an orchestra. So if you look at Giancarlo Menotti, if you look at Leonard Bernstein, those are composers that really composed in classical music, with a classical music background, but with more accessible sounds and a harmony that is more jazzy. So they add, when I say a jazzy harmony, I would say if Mozart would have written a chord, these composers would have added a couple of notes that would sound a little strange at that time, but now with the ear that we have listening to all that, to all this jazz, blues, and pop repertoire, for us it's really, really normal, but for them it was really pushing forwards because people didn't already know that kind of sounds in their ears. So that's what we can see. We can see that it led to Broadway music. So if you listen to Bernstein, let's say, which is kind of like, Bernstein, I don't know if you've heard that name before, but he comes after Castelnuovo-Tedesco, and he really has in his music some sounds, some parts of it that really sound like music you would hear when you go to a synagogue. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it in English, but there's some very cheerful music that you would hear during a wedding, let's say, and it can pass in the very middle of a symphony, let's say. And you hear that, and it's so cheerful, you know, and there's a lot of percussions as well, and yeah, does that answer to your question?
Has it ever happened in your career that maybe there were some episode of anti-Semitic censorship of this music or other musicians of Jewish origins?
I think that the biggest part of it is the fact that these people had to go from Europe to America is kind of the biggest part, because all these developments would be part of the European musical history instead of the American musical history. So all these great European composers had to become American, and then they created for us our musical identity, which was supposed to be the European ones because they're all European composers. So what was the question? Did I answer the question well?
I asked about a possible censorship, but I don't want to occupy all the space here.
Yeah, but
thank you so much.
No, it's okay. It's fine. Well, I don't know any censorship of that, but the fact that they had to move is probably one of the greatest censorship of that kind of music. But it's not like in Russia, let's say. It's not like the music in Russia that we can see at a certain era when they were using poems that would talk against the government but hide things. You know, it's not that kind of censorship. But there is certainly some type of it, yes.
Thank you very much. I see that there is a question by Igor.
Thank you very much for such an interesting and insightful conversation, really. I have kind of philological question, because I was very interested by what you said, that Liszt tried to put in music his own feelings, what he felt reading Dante's Divine Comedy. So I was wondering if you can expand on this, say something more, and at the same time, if we know there are documents about this, so like letters in which Liszt talks about Dante, and kind of more philological questions, sorry, altogether, if he read Dante in translation, or he could access the original, or he tried to read the original, just if you know. Thank you very much.
Okay, so very interesting questions. Thank you very much. I try, maybe sometimes I could ask you to just recall them a little bit, not so that I don't go too much far from the original question. So let's start with the first. You've asked me to expand a little bit on the feelings of Liszt while reading Dante. Of course, there is no document that can objectively say to us what he felt in a particular passage of the comedy. Firstly, Liszt was one of the greatest, let's say, users of culture in his time, as maybe it's not anymore the case today for everybody, but once there were no distractions and no Netflix, no other things, so culture was a great part of lives of people like Liszt, Chopin, or the other great composers, great painters, etc., etc. And of course, I am pretty sure that he read Dante and the Divina Commedia in the original language, because he was he spoke Italian very well, and he used to tour a lot in all Europe, because it was really, let's say, it was always playing everywhere in Europe. And so the language of literature and the language of culture, so Italian, French, it was almost his first language. And it is for this that I say that maybe he's read Dante in Italian. And we have some letters that he wrote while actually traveling in Italy with Dante in his pocket. And he wrote these letters to different people, and sometimes also his companion of the time, Princess d'Agoult, has written them also to mention what Liszt was doing. But these letters actually only are useful to us only to say when he actually composed the piece, but doesn't tell us anymore, at least the ones that I read, because of course I haven't read all the letters that the Liszt has written in his life, because that would be way too much. But these letters are useful only to attest when he started to compose, when he started to have the idea of writing this piece. But they don't tell us actually much more. Maybe they have just inside one sentence where of like yes, anyway, Liszt also started to write a piece about Dante, and then it continues with all the other things that it was saying. So nothing is objective, first of all. But I like to say that Liszt was a man of incredible imagination. Of course, his music can certify his fantasy and ability to imagine and to create sounds and to create musical landscapes. And it is for this that I say that we are experiencing all the feelings that he was feeling. Sorry for the double feel. while reading Dante, because I can see him reading this incredible Divina Commedia and already imagining some sort of orchestration of or maybe let's say translation from text to music. And this is why I say this. And moreover, the musical elements which are inside the poem tell us that he has some very precise ideas, and also, let's say, topic ideas, because the opening of the piece with this interval of tritone is symbolic also, and a symbol has to be a symbol has to be understood both by the person that writes it and by the person that reads or listens to it. So I would say that there is this let's say exchange between all the different elements that finally come together in the final version of the piece. I don't know if I have answered to all your questions. I hope yes, but if you have doubts, please also remind me what were.
No. It was excellent. Thank you very much. Now you perfectly explained what I wanted to do. I found very interesting what you just said about speaking of translation and translating. This is something that has always been one of the questions, no, talking about Dante, particularly outside Italy, when you have to translate Dante. This can be said about any poetry, but Dante is clearly, for many reasons, a stumbling block, no, in many respects. And in fact, I remember there is an old book whose title was translating Dante, The Art of the Impossible, no? And first of all, from the matter and so on, up to the philosophy and so on. So it was very interesting what you just said, that being inspired by Dante and putting Dante into music is really a kind of way of translating Dante. And so I was, if you want to say that, what do you think about this? So how effective is what Liszt did, or in general? I don't know if there are, I'm sure there are other examples about translating Dante in music.
Yes, there are other examples of pieces inspired by Dante in music. We decided not to put them into the concert because very often they are not for piano, or they are not for only for voice. For example, there is a symphonic poem by Tchaikovsky, which is called Francesca da Rimini. And then there is the first ones that comes to mind, but there are many others. There is also an opera by Sergei Rachmaninoff, of which we would have sang an excerpt with Carole-Anne, of an aria which I cannot name because, of course, it is in Russian. But this is her job to sing it. And but also speaking of translation, I think the musical translation of so powerful literary content as the Divina Commedia maybe is the only one that really works. I do agree with you when you say that, when you remind of this book, translating Dante, translating the impossible, with all the great poets and all the great poetry. Of course, if you change the language from its original to another one, you lose always something. And I do experience this. I did experience this maybe also not only with Dante, but I remember that when I wanted to learn French, I wanted to do it only to read Proust in French, which was as if I didn't read it before. And but maybe since music always works, even if you speak Italian, English, French, or German, or any language in general, maybe for this, music can be a more useful translation. Of course, not point by point, because it will be very long to translate all the commedia into a piece of music, but only to, let's say, drive us through the more important moments of the story, or at least to drive us through a general idea, conception, musical conception of something which is made by words, so completely different also. I hope this answers a little bit your question.
Yes, thank you very much. What I was just thinking, and then of course, I will leave the floor to the Paradiso. We are dealing with the Purgatorio in this edition of the Dante School, but the Paradiso is probably very interesting because this is a theme that is a Dantean theme itself, no? The harmony of the spheres, no? Which is in the Middle Ages, or at least even before, from Augustine, Boetius, and so on. It's a really key question in the Middle Ages, no? The harmony of the spheres, which is music. Even Augustine wrote a treatise, De Musica, no? So the Dante Paradise, in many respects, is the realm of music, no? Whereas the Inferno is more drama, Purgatorio the visual arts, and finally Paradiso. So that would be interesting to see how musicians could translate the Paradiso in particular. Turn the Paradiso into music. Thank you very much.
Well, I think if I can say just a little last thing about what you just said, this is a personal thought that I've always had in my life, and I always was convinced that it was much easier to find a way to represent Inferno or Purgatorio, let's say something bad, and then to represent something positive and good. And for instance, maybe Liszt's soul and capability of playing also devilish pieces was particularly put in place into the Après une lecture de Dante, and also in other compositions that he wrote. But it seems interesting that he actually finds a way to represent also paradise, and but the paradise that he wants to show maybe is not so much the harmony of the spheres. It's not so calm actually as it will be in the Dante Symphony composed some years later. And I suggest you all, maybe I will post a link as Carole-Anne just did with Bernstein. I suggest you all to listen to the Purgatorio and Magnificat, which are the second and third movement from the Dante Symphony of Liszt, where we can experience a description of paradise in a much calmer way than the Après une lecture de Dante, where paradise is more the description of the power of God and of all the, let's say, also relief maybe that Dante is feeling after having traveled around the worst place of earth, which is Inferno, and then also have climbed Purgatorio. So it is a powerful moment, and I like to call it a heroic paradise, because maybe to reach the paradise for a romantic man, so not for Dante, but for the time and for the man as Liszt, so the man that was reading Dante's Commedia in the Romantic period, maybe to reach the paradise is an heroic act and a heroic achievement in life. And Liszt would have tried to do it also in his personal biography, because it was a desire for him since he was a young man to become a priest, and then actually in the final part of his life in Italy, when he decided to move to Italy and to stay there, and almost until his death, actually he did become a priest.
Thank you very much. Just one very last thing. I find that this perspective is very interesting, the romantic perspective, because I don't think it's a coincidence that Romanticism is the historical moment in which Dante is rediscovered. Because we think that Dante has always been appreciated from the very top, but actually, let's say, at the end of the 16th century, and particularly in the 17th century, for most of the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th century, Dante had something like in two editions. So it was not very appreciated. So this is very interesting. And the fact that, and this deals probably with the change of aesthetics, no? The classicist aesthetics wasn't able really to understand Dante. And Dante, for example, for Voltaire, was considered like a monster, interestingly enough, like Shakespeare. Later, with the discovery of the sublime, in particular, philosophical inquiry into the sublime and beautiful by Edmund Burke, I like to remember, because Burke was a student and intellectual who graduated at Trinity College in Dublin, and this is a key text, the philosophical inquiry into sublime and beautiful, because this is at the beginning of the re-evaluation of authors like Dante in particular. Dante was considered like difficult or particularly obscure, or the poet of the infernal pain, you know? And later, thanks to the new aesthetics of Romanticism, was really understood in the right way.
Well, I don't know if it was the right way, but it was certainly the beginning of a rereading. I think that it was a choice of parts. And I was also thinking of the rediscovery of human voices in Purgatorio, and the number of choruses you have there. I think there was a definition of Purgatorio as un immenso ospedale salmodiante, where these groups of souls that keep singing together. And since this morning, I think we spoke about a sort of a contiguity between the Vita Nuova and Purgatorio. I was, thinking about Carole-Anne interpretation of these pieces that had so much in them about the rediscovery of the human voice, and I was wondering if she could maybe elaborate.
Yes. Well, so I had lots of thoughts with what Igor said as well. So where to begin? When we were looking for some repertoire, I spent many days in my computer in Belgium and just looking for repertoire and analyzing what was composed. So once a composer is a composer, of course, they look at other arts, and when they are inspired, they try to create something. But at that point, when they begin at that point, they have to choose whether it's for this or that instrument, whether it's for the voice, whether it's for the piano, whether it's for a low voice, a high voice, many voices together, whether it's for a voice with a big orchestra, or whether, there's plenty of choices. So when we looked at that, there were so many different pieces of Dante's work that was put to music. But let's say Purgatorio was always for baritone. So what can you do when you have a soprano voice? You can't really change what the composer wanted for this and ask someone to change the key and to adjust it to all, because just like when Dante decides that his poem is in Italian because he's Italian, well, it's hard to translate that. But we can also look at the perspective of a composer that is not Italian, who loves what Dante creates, and it resonates in this composer, but somehow the composer is not Italian and cannot write for Italian. Let's say, recently I've been singing lots of Liszt in Italian, and it's sometimes frustrating because when he writes with how he pronounced it. So sometimes he would put the wrong the wrong part of the word on the important beat because he didn't know that the stress of this word was earlier or after. You know, he didn't know that. So sometimes it's frustrating when the composers do write in Italian and they are not Italian, because then it's kind of hard. You know, it's kind of hard to really fall on the good spot for each and every important words. So what can you do? Do you sing Rachmaninov, who wrote about the Dante's works? Do you ask him to sing in Russian, as the soul of his music is so Russian? Do you ask him to write for Italian when he doesn't know? So that's a kind of thing that they have to go through. And yes, of course, many of the Purgatorio pieces were for choruses and were for male voices. The other thing that I noticed, what was the other idea I had when I listened to you, Renata? You said, I can't remember. I had an idea on something you said, and I think I forgot it.
It is important, you will come back. But I know Gianluca Caccialupi has a question for Axel, in fact.
Yeah, I was thinking about this relationship between poetry and music, and especially that with Dante, it should be at the same time very hard, obviously, to compose something over it. But it's also stimulating because there is no philological musical tradition on Dante, because, for example, for Occitan poetry, we knew that the troubadours composed and wrote music together. So the same author both composed many times and wrote the text. So we have also a lot of music text for Occitan poetry. And then when the poetry moved to Italy, the poetry was just written. Then sometimes the music was added later by some musician, but we don't have any evidence of this music based on Dante, because we have evidences, for example, from the Renaissance, for Petrarch, for a lot of other Renaissance poetry, because we have the Madrigali. So for Dante, I imagine it's a difficult operation also because we don't know actually how it could sound at the time.
I don't know whom the question was addressed to.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe Axel that was also talking about, for example, how Liszt could recover this. Maybe this tradition was created by the Romantic age about music on Dante.
Yes, I think actually maybe I would really separate the music of the troubadour that composed poetry and music in the same instant with the, let's say, solo poetry that would have spread in countries like Italy. Actually, I'm not able to answer to the fact if Dante was putting music in his times, and if there were representations of Dante's poetry, not only of Divina Commedia, but in general also of other works with music. But for what's about Liszt, I think that his musical decisions and the musical representations of Dante are not necessarily they have not necessarily a contact with other previous traditions. This is not because he invented a tradition, but this is only because as often as for every art in his period, there were there was a style, the Romantic style, that he applied to a much let's say older poetry. But this doesn't mean that there is necessarily a link between different traditions. I don't know if it does answer your question, but I sincerely don't think that Liszt actually thought so much about how to treat the text, but it was just an inspiration for him. As if maybe Carole-Anne can also say this, as all the other operatic composers did, also with some material which was not made for opera. I don't know if you can also say something. Yes.
Yes. Well, at that time we also have to think about the fact that composers were not thinking of making art to live for a long time. They were thinking of eating and paying the bills. So the choice of the subjects and the pieces is also made to please the public and the things that were asked them for. Let's say if I do a concert, it can happen to me to ask for a composition for me to a composer that is currently living, and that's the kind of thing that they needed to do. Of course, they composed for themselves, like we choose a piece for our interpretation because we think we might grow from it, and we think that it would suit us, and we would make it live greatly, But these composers also had to meet this that type of demand, as Puccini wrote a great triptychal from, there's an opera that he wrote, 3 little operas. One is Il Tabarro, the second one is Suor Angelica, and the third one is, of course, Gianni Schicchi, which is like a little mention, a little thing that Dante mentioned in his Divina Commedia, and then he took it and wrote an entire opera on the topic of Buoso Donati, so it was more to sell at that time, because he knew that story that he would invent on this Dante, on this mention in the Dante work, he knew that this would sell and would go well into the end of this opera, and that made it live for such a long time, because we still play it now when it's Puccini, so. And I think I thought of what I wanted to say, Renata, about what you said earlier. I wrote it down. Oh, yes. So when we were looking at some repertoire for the concert as well, we found that I found that composers from every generation somehow took some of Dante's sonetti or stories to put them to music. Sometimes it's just that for a couple of those eras, the subject is is matching a little less with the music, as classical, romantic, and contemporary, let's say, they all have the topics that are the more often taken from that are the most often chosen for them in order to please the public that was living at that time too. Because let's say if the Mozart was writing over such subjects as the right to have relationships with a woman that is not ours, or that kind of thing, that would be less current right now. If a man writes about how a maid could not want to have some dangerous relationship with the husband of her mistress, which is not currently it's not current anymore because we don't have maids anymore to live in our house as well. Fewer people have that. So that's kind of all the things that we have to look at when we look at composers and what they chose to put into music and which era it did fit. But Donizetti also wrote about the Purgatorio, and there are some very contemporary works as well that we looked at but didn't consider for the concert in order to please you.
Thanks, Bob. Very clear. Thank you.
I
For
think
the
that
answer, I mean.
I think that Igor has a comment.
Yes, from the perspective of a medievalist, I think that Gianluca Caccialuppi's question is very interesting, and I think that a possible answer, or more than one answer, is in the book that I quoted by Francesco Ciabattoni, Dante's Journey to Polyphony, which is, to my knowledge, the best book on Dante's knowledge of music, because as far as Ciabattoni points out, Dante was familiar not only with monody, which is in line with his time, but even anticipated polyphony, which is very interesting. And then the question, the debate on when this separation between poetry and music actually took place is very interesting, because as Gianluca was saying, if you read Provençal poetry, then you have poets would say, I compose both poetry and music. No, there are different examples, and this does not happen in Dante. Clearly, if we read the Rime and so on, the Divine Comedy. But what is interesting is that, and I wanted to mention Purgatorio 2, because in Purgatorio 2 there is a musician who is Casella. In Casella and Dante, it seems from Dante's witness that that Casella used to sing Amor che nella mente mi ragiona, no? So, which is a canzone, famous canzone by Dante Alighieri. So we still have traces of this relationship in Dante, whereas let's say from Petrarch this has disappeared completely. For example, voi ascoltate il rime sparse il suono, that suono doesn't mean that someone actually composed music on the poems of the canzoniere. Thank you.
Well, it seems to have started, we seem to have started a conversation that will go on for the whole night, but we have that frame dell'arte, tanto il buon sartor che tanto è del panno e fa la gonna. Anyway, no, I was wondering if there are in fact other questions that we could, still offer to our wonderful musicians here who have been so very generous in preparing the concerts, adapting to the new situation, being with us at different times, bearing with us with the technical issues, and then being so generous in answering all our questions. I have a feeling that we are, in the back of our minds, we just have some music still playing with questions we will ask to ourselves tomorrow, perhaps. And I'm reminded of a beautiful poem by Shelley, Music When Soft Voices Die, Remain in the Memory. So it's something that really stays with us. And we are, I think, Francisco, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we have already covered the time that was we had planned to devote to this encounter. And well, I think I hope it's not me that will have the task of concluding this adventure, the second part of a 3 or maybe more year adventure on Dante and the summer school. But I really want to thank Carole-Anne and Axel for being with us and all through the drama of this preparation. and I hope it is the beginning of a long-standing collaboration with you guys. It's been great to have you on our side, on board. So maybe Francesco and Igor would like to add up to this.
Yes, I would like to thanks again, Carole-Anne and Axel, but also all of you who follow all these days, very busy days. And again, sorry for technical inconvenience we had at the very last moment, but at least we hope that everything worked. And if you have any comments, any suggestion, any feedback that you want to share with us, please write them in the chat now, or you can say it out loud or write an email to our email address. And we hope that you will join us also next year in a, let's say, in a different different circumstances. So again, thank you very, very much.
And thank you, Francesca and Renata, and thank you in particular to our two artists, really, because it's great to end with music, no, with music. As I said, the Paradiso closes with music, no, with music, which is in Dante's medieval mentality, the image of God, no, because it's the tool, no, the instrument that can tell about the creation and the order of the universe, no? So thank you very much. I think it's the best way. We have read Dante in many different ways and through many different disciplines. So I think that it's also important to thank all the participants of this second edition of the Dublin Dante School, and we have to start thinking about the Paradiso, and you have inspired us, no, through your music. So thank you, really, thank you very much. And it's time, I'm afraid it's Renata again.
My suggestion was to have a glass of wine but nearby so that we could say slancia and arrivederci a presto. I don't know if any of you have managed to get a glass of wine. I have it, but I didn't want to be the only one. So slancia to y'all, and see you back at the Institute for those who have a chance to come by. Good. So Francisco will take a picture, so we will be framed on this. Thank you. See you soon.
Okay.
Thank you very much.